All right, so we can go ahead and get started. Believe it or not, this is the second to last one of these. We have already flown through our year, and we are talking today about springtime festivals. Next time, we'll talk about summertime festivals, and then we'll have more or less covered the whole trip around the sun and how people experience it, at least to some degree. So start thinking about what you want for next year, because we'll have to
I
start.
liked what you mentioned. I liked what you mentioned.
What was that?
That was when you were talking about going into more depth. People have talked to you about why do we have the colors in the altar, the certain seasons, and just kind of the Lutheran 101, but more in depth.
Oh, like the liturgical year stuff.
Yes, yes.
Okay. I'll give some thought to that, how we could turn that into a monthly series for the year. Something will come to me, I'm sure. I'll let it percolate for a month and see what comes out.
Karen, we can't hear you. Karen, we can't hear you.
I forgot I did that. I think that this whole thing about politics and theology and looking at it from an historical biblical point of view
Hmm,
might be interesting.
that would be very interesting. Hmm.
Because Jesus wasn't political.
Yes, he was.
Well,
Just not partisan.
well, okay, there's another question. Because
Politics,
I don't think about him being political.
it's just because political means having to do with the community life of the people. So everything that we do outside of our own personal selves is political.
Okay, we need to look at that. That would be a good thing. Because it's not something that just automatically strings to my head, you know?
Yeah, well, that's because that's not how that word is used in
Right,
that conversation usually. It's usually used as a weapon to
right,
say, "Oh, you can't talk about that. That's political."
right,
Well, then I might as well shut my mouth because everything I'd say is political. It's
right.
just whether or not it's currently in contention or not.
Uh-huh. Well, it's something I need to know more about, I think.
All right, I'll put that on the list too. Think about it. Maybe I can come up with some way that they both make some appearances.
Okay.
All right, anyhow, let's talk about spring.
Yes.
So I went back to our fall harvest festivals slideshow to take a look at what we had talked about then, because of course, spring is in some ways the opposite of fall or autumn. We again have the equinox happening where we have the shift from having shorter days to shorter nights rather than in the fall where we start to lose the daylight, um, which I think certainly lends itself to feelings of hope and better life and things like that, especially for those of us who are of Northern European ancestry, uh, to have to live in a place where um, it is so cold and so bitter and raining or snowing or icing for so many months of the year, and to not have a guaranteed source of warmth certainly is a scary thing to have to go through every year. And so to come up to the time when that finally ends and you can survive without doing all that extra work because the weather isn't actively trying to kill you anymore is a positive thing. course, around here, we get to the weather is actively trying to kill us in the summertime, which we can talk about next time. But we've got the weather changing. A lot of places, it will be wet. Um, the the spring there are places where there is not, a series of spring, summer, fall, winter, but perhaps rainy and dry. But even in those places, typically that rainy season is considered often to be spring, in terms of the at least the agricultural cycle, because obviously you are not going to plant and wait for your crops to grow during the dry season. You're going to do that when your crops have a chance of actually surviving. But then there's also places that, have less of a wet season, more of a monsoon season. And then in that case, you can't plant for those because then everything will just get washed away. So certainly not a universal experience around the world, but there is a sense of some of the themes related to springtime being present, I would say, in some way universally, um, just maybe not at the same time of the year. And of course, we have to talk about and remind ourselves that just because we live in the northern hemisphere and we're having spring now, we've also got our friends in the southern hemisphere who do have similar seasons to us, but they are in the opposite part of the year. And so they are now, as we get our sun back, we are taking it away from them and they will have to go into the colder and darker winter months. So how all of those experiences change our understanding of spring is certainly something that we have to keep in mind as we think about and talk about this. So, like I did with the um, fall harvest festivals, I wanted to just bring some themes, some images that are related to springtime, at least um, for the internet. I just searched for images to see what popped up. The daffodils and the rain boots and the flowers and all that certainly was the most most widely appearing. But I thought it was interesting. The person with the allergies, I certainly feel that. I'm going through some of that myself. Um, So to remind ourselves that while springtime is perhaps a time where we've got, hope growing and warmth growing, it's not always peachy for everyone, as we get into spring. And then I thought it was interesting to be reminded of the ancients' penchant for connecting all of these um, different phenomena to gods and goddesses. And so I saw this picture of um, Persephone, the goddess of spring, perhaps, and Hades. So you might be familiar with the story that Hades, the god of the underworld, was in love with this beautiful goddess Persephone, and he knew that Persephone's mother, Demeter, who was the goddess of goddess of the harvest, goddess of agriculture, I guess, if you will, um, loved her daughter too much to allow her to go down to live with Hades in the underworld, and so he abducted her and took her into the underworld. And Demeter, not knowing that where she had gone, searched everywhere for her. And in her search, she neglects the earth, and in her despair, nothing grows on the earth. And so the people start to starve. And um, the the gods who are hearing their anguish of the people, the hungry people who are crying out to the gods for help, um, go to Demeter and say, "Hey, what's going on here?" and they discover that Persephone has been in Hades with Hades all this time. And so Zeus commanded Hades to return Persephone. And when Hades received this request, he said that he would comply, but as is typical with the god of the underworld, he um, did a little trickery and he tricked Persephone into eating some pomegranate seeds. And pomegranates are one of the symbols connected to the underworld, to death. But generally speaking, it was understood that if you ate food of the underworld, you had to stay there. Um, and so they ended up making a deal that Persephone would stay in the underworld for originally in the original story in which this myth appears. For 1/3 of the year, he would stay in the underworld, and the remainder of the year, she would come back up to the earth and spend time with her mother and the other gods. Um, so that was in the Homeric hymn version of this story. Later, writers changed it from 1/3 of the year to half the year, and um, I don't know myself about the weather patterns of Greece enough to know, um, whether that which one matches better to their experience of winter. Um, but one of those probably was a decision made for that purpose. And so the belief is for the ancient Greeks that spring and summer are when Persephone is with her mother and her mother is happy and can focus on bringing life to the earth. And then during the fall and winter, she is missing her daughter and is sad. And so she lets the earth go barren, it gets covered with snow, etc., etc. And so that's the story of why we have springtime and why we have wintertime. Um, Obviously, that is not the only mythology related to spring and summer, but it's certainly one that is common to quote unquote Western cultures. And so I thought I would bring that up because I thought it was, it's interesting um, that even when we talked about fall, there was a sense of melancholy to some of it, facing down the cold parts of the year, um, having to be inside more, things like that. But there's still that reminder of some of that, even within the hopefulness and newness of springtime that I think we have to we have to remember as we work through um, some of our holidays. So, any other thoughts about springtime that I missed?
Well, I'm just looking at the painting with Persephone and Hades, and it's interesting that he's in gray tones.
Mm-hmm.
That's yeah, I like that, and she's in pastels.
Yeah, the barrenness of the earth during the winter almost matches to the barrenness that we imagine the underworld to experience. Although they do have the Elysian fields and things like that too. So I don't know if that counts as something that's not barren or not really growing, I guess. Anything, Karen?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, then let's
No, I
hop
like the
in.
story though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then let's hop into some of our springtime holidays, rituals. Um, we've kind of been starting most of the time. We start with a Jewish holiday. Um, I've I've mostly done that because Judaism is one of the oldest religions that we, at least in the United States, have a little bit more of an understanding of. Some of these holidays actually have roots, some of the ones um, in the Indian subcontinent and in the other parts of Asia that we're not, we don't have as much of a cultural connection to, are older. But I try to kind of go through um, ish um, a chronological sense, I guess, other than the ones that I hold on to that are Christian traditions that I usually hold on to until the end. So starting with the Jewish observance of Passover, which takes place on the 15th day in the month of Nisan. Nisan is the first month of the year, so this is um, halfway through the first month. So it's not the new year, which is interesting, but it is 15 days after the new year. And so, because of course the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, there is a little bit of wiggle room for them, and it typically, Passover typically falls between March 26th and April 25th of the Gregorian calendar. Of course, remembering that the day um, for Jews begins in the evening. And so the 15th day actually begins in the evening of the 14th day, as far as we're concerned. And the Seder, special Seder meal, is eaten on that evening, which in their understanding is the 15th day. In our understanding, it's actually the day before the 15th day, since we operate with a midnight to midnight or overnight, morning to morning almost kind of experience of days. Um, and so Passover is a spring festival, and it remains so actually intentionally. There, obviously over the course of time, if you just let both the solar calendar and the lunar calendar run, they would end up getting very much off sync with one another. And so to make sure that Passover never starts before spring, before the full moon after the vernal equinox. There was a tradition in ancient Israel that the lunar new year, the first day of the first month, this Nisan, would not start until the barley was ripe. So the barley being one of the uh, earlier crops to be ready. Um, they wanted to make sure that they were fully in spring, and of course, without the atomic clocks and things like that we have today. They just had to use kind of their observations of the world around them to figure this out. And so, if you think that the way that we calculate Easter is strange, try calculating your Passover based on the the 15th day after the Lunar New Year, which is the full moon that happens after the barley is ripe or something like that. Very, very confusing. And if the barley was not ripe yet, um, at the time that they were ready, that they ran out of days in their calendar, then they would actually add another month called Adar 2, which would help them to get through until they could start again with Nissan at the appropriate time, so that they wouldn't get too far off of the cycles of the sun. That, of course, made a big difference in their experience of harvest and things like that. Um, Passover is a protective rite, a rite meant to keep the family or the tribe or the people safe. Another word that scholars and theologians use instead of protective is apotropaic. You don't need to remember that name. You can just use protective. But it's a type of rite meant to provide safety for the people. And so we have in in the scriptures we have the theological and biblical um, underpinnings of this particular holiday. But scholars who study these things outside of the biblical witness suggest that this has some kind of connection to extremely ancient tribes where they were attempting to get the gods, whatever it was that they had as powers in their lives to provide them some kind of safety through the new year past past the first moon of the year. Um, and this so but in terms of the biblical witness and the theological underpinning and the beliefs of the Jews related to Passover, we can look it's very clear and actually repeated several times in the Bible, particularly in the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 12 tells the story of Moses and where after the ninth plague in Egypt, when the Israelites were in bondage to Pharaoh and still refused to let the people go. And so God is preparing for the 10th plague. And so then Moses calls all of the elders together and he says to them, "Go select lambs for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel and the two doorposts with the blood in the basin. None of you shall go outside the door of your house until morning, for the Lord will pass through to strike down the Egyptians. When he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over that door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you down. You shall observe this as a perpetual ordinance for you and your children. When you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this observance. And when your children ask you, 'What does this observance mean to you?' you shall say, 'It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he struck down the Egyptians, but spared our houses.'" And then the people bowed down and worshiped God. So just one of the tellings of this story and why the people do what they do. Um, and over the course of time, this story has morphed into the Seder meal. Um, there is even though Passover is a particular event. There's the Passover Seder takes place on one day. There is quite a bit to do beforehand and quite a bit to do afterward to make sure that the full experience is properly observed. And so the first thing that you have to do, because the people the Bible tells us that the people were in a rush to get this taken care of. They didn't have time to wait for their bread to rise, and so they did not have any leaven. And so removing leaven from your house is a very, very important element of Passover. And so what is forbidden is not just the consumption of leaven, but also keeping leaven, even owning leaven is forbidden during Passover. And Passover lasts for in most communities, Passover lasts for more than just the one day. And so there is a process that you have to use to remove all of the leaven from your house, a thorough house cleaning, even to make sure that there is no leaven anywhere in the house. According to the standard Jewish law, anything that is considered leavening and is the size of an olive or larger counts as having leaven in your possession, and so they have to get rid of that. But most housekeepers go even further than this. They clean the seams of their kitchen counters to make sure that there's no flour or yeast left. They, pull out their ovens and make sure nothing has fallen beside it. All those types of things, and you can't Um, you can't keep any leaven for use after Passover. So you can either give it away to someone else or you can burn it, and um, you will make sure that you don't have any in your house by cleaning up. Now, because as time has gone on, different ways of making our bread rise have developed, and so there's some um, interesting stuff that kind of falls into this because, for example, yeast itself, fermentation itself, is not forbidden because wine is not just permitted, it's required as part of the Passover Seder. And so it's not just yeast, it's certain kinds of yeast, it's certain kinds of rising, um, and it's all natural ones. So leaven is not considered to count when you're talking about baking soda, baking powder, things like that, because those things um, act as leavening agents using a chemical reaction, not through fermentation. But not all kinds of fermentation are wrong either, because wine is also created through a fermenting process, and so it's very can be very confusing for non-Jews to figure out, what does and doesn't count. You can use baking soda, um, but you can't use, um, for example, sourdough would be not allowed because that uses the biological fermentation rather than the chemical fermentation. So lots of interesting little details that we don't typically think about because we don't feel like we have to follow along quite as well. So there's this process for several days before Passover begins of removing all the leaven from the house. And then there's actually a process the day before the Seder, so on the 14th during the day. There are two things that are asked of the families. The first one only applies to firstborn sons. They are commanded to celebrate the fast of the firstborn, which not recognizes that the Hebrew firstborn sons were spared by God during this 10th plague, and that only applies to the firstborn sons. And then there's a process called nullification of leaven, and it's a kind of a prayer, a statement that you make over your house. And you say, any leaven that is in my possession, which I have not seen and have not removed and do not know about, should be annulled and become ownerless like the dust of the earth. So making sure that even if there is any left, it does not belong to me anymore. I release it. I do not claim it. It is not mine. And if you find some leaven later, like say you didn't have a chance to get down into the cellar or something, and you find a jar of leaven or whatever, because you've done this, you don't have to you don't have to feel like you're in trouble, but you can't use it. You have to acknowledge that you did reject this leaven, and you have to again either give it away or burn it to get it out of your house and out of your ability to use it. Um, so then we get to the actual Passover evening, and the main part of this is in history was the sacrificial lamb when the temple in Jerusalem still stood. People, just like it says in the story, people who have enough people in their family to completely consume a young lamb um, would have to offer one as sacrifice at the temple in the afternoon on the 14th, and then they had to eat the entire thing that night. So if the family wasn't big enough to finish the entire offering in one sitting, then they could get together with another family and they could sacrifice together, and then they could go and eat it together because you could not leave any left. You even had to um, roast it, prepare it for being eaten without removing any of the body parts. So they were all eaten together with the unleavened bread and the bitter herbs that are used in the Passover Seder. You also had to be very careful not to break any bones from the offering, which is um, kind of a there's an allusion in the Gospels where they were going to break Jesus' legs when he was dying to make sure that he fully suffocated. He could no longer push himself up off the cross to take a breath. That's typically what they would do to people who were crucified to make sure that they died. It was actually considered a kindness to cut off some of their suffering more quickly. But they made sure in the story that it very specifically said they went to go and break Jesus' legs, but he was already dead, and so they didn't have to do. And that is a reference to this, not breaking any bones from the Passover offering, because Jesus, um, is considered by the gospel writers, some of them at least, to be that sacrificial lamb for all people for all time, rather than having to do it year after year after year. So, of course, nowadays there's no temple, and so there are no sacrifices there, and so you don't have the eating of the sacrificial lamb. And so sometimes there is a piece of the matzah that is used um, in the rite that is considered. It's called the afikomen, and that sometimes that is used as a replacement for the sacrificial lamb. And so instead of going and um, creating this, taking your lamb for slaughter, you have this uh, Passover Seder, and you have a certain series of readings from Exodus, and you drink wine, and um, you eat things to remind yourself of the experience of the Israelites as they were suffering in Egypt and as they were rescued by God. So then there are some festival days after the actual day of Passover, and depending on where you are in the world, some of those days are more considered more special than than others. Sometimes you take the day off work and you have a picnic, things like that. Different Passover treats are shared among families and friends, things like that. And then there is, after 7 days, there is a second day of Passover that in some places is celebrated. And this is the commemoration of the day that the Israelites reached the Red Sea and were able to pass through the sea, and the Egyptians were destroyed. And so they were once again redeemed by God that 7 days later. So let's see. I think I got everything. There's the picture there of the items that are used in the Seder. There's a picture there of the family together. Oh, the picture of the grocery store there that has all the plastic on it. That is a grocery store in Israel, and it is covering up all the items that contain leaven. They won't sell them to you for so many days before Passover, so that they make sure that everybody is doing the right thing. So if you live in Israel and you are not Jewish, too bad. You also don't get any leaven. Although I did read somewhere that one of the things that you can do to get rid of your leaven before Passover is you can sell it. And so I guess if you are not Jewish, you could buy leaven from one of your neighbors who had failed to plan properly and get rid of all of it ahead of time. Any questions about Passover?
Why is the boy in the foreground the only male wearing a yarmulke?
Oh, interesting. I didn't notice that.
That was my question also.
Hmm. I don't know. He is of the appropriate age. Um, so perhaps he is preparing for or has recently accomplished his uh, bar mitzvah, and so maybe it has something to do with that. But I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too, is that maybe he had some kind of special things that he had to do because of his bar mitzvah.
Yeah. The other thing that could be possible is, there's a sharing of the reading. So maybe that family has one yarmulke that they pass around and the reader wears it. There are the questions that are asked by children traditionally in the story to help to remind everyone of the story and remind everyone of why they're doing the things that they're doing. So maybe it has something to do with that. I'm not sure. Anything else that I might be able to actually answer? All right. Well, then let's move on to our Muslim neighbors and talk about Eid al-Fitr. So we talked last time. Was that just last time or the time before? Maybe the time before, about Ramadan, um, and the forgiveness and confession um, lesson. We talked about Ramadan as a whole month of fasting during the daylight hours, and Eid al-Fitr is the um, commemoration of the end of Ramadan. So it falls on the first day of Shawwal, which is the month after Ramadan, the 10th month in the Islamic calendar. So the Jews are having a, an observation in the first month of their calendar. The Muslims are having one in the 10th month of their calendar, right around the same time. So obviously, these calendars don't all match up very well. And all of this is happening in our third or fourth, usually, month of our calendar. So Eid al-Fitr is the first day that you are able to eat during the day after you've been doing this for an entire month. You start the day with a communal prayer. It is obligatory to attend um, as a group. You cannot just do this by yourself or even with your family at home unless you've got some kind of other circumstances going on. It's very important that it be together with the community. After you complete the prayer, there you follow the prayer with visits to relatives and sharing meals and giving gifts and otherwise feeling celebratory because now you can finally go back to eating on regular days. But there are still special parts to it that help you to continue the feeling, some of the feeling of Ramadan and some of the purposes of Ramadan. In many places, there is the requirement that you make some kind of act of charity for the poor and needy before you participate in that special morning prayer. And so, just like during Ramadan, you're supposed to be focusing on, um, you know, forgiveness and becoming kind of a better person and giving alms. There's this act of charity that is even part of the Eid. So we're not just forgetting that there are people in the world who are in need. We continue that past the month of Ramadan. The rest of it is honestly very based on culture and based on the area that the person and group happens to be living in the world. There are lots of public celebrations, some parades, um, sharing of traditional foods. Um, Lots of people go and start to buy new things that they had not been buying during Ramadan, and so the markets can get pretty crowded on this particular day as people are buying new clothes and things for their festive meals for the day and things like that. Um, but definitely lots of connecting with each other, lots of being generous to each other, lots of strengthening of family connections and community connections. Um, so there's obviously in places where there is a large Muslim population, this is often a public holiday. Um, Noting that during Ramadan, because it's an entire month, you can't really let everybody stay home for an entire month. But of course, having hopefully made some accommodations for people knowing that they can't eat all day, then they take this day off and then they can start back into their normal lives later. that week. Um, one of the um, one of the commonalities that I found across different countries that I just kind of looked into some very different random countries, some that are Muslim majority, some that very much aren't. But it seems like sugary treats are extremely popular in lots of different places. For example, in Germany, the Muslims in Germany have what they call Sugar Fest, and everything is all sugary, and lots of picnics, lots of just kind of celebratory spending time with the people that you love, and lots of lots of charitable acts, lots of connecting with people who are in need. Any questions there? All right. All right, so let's move on to Holi. Holi is a major Hindu festival. So we have talked about some other Hindu festivals and how they, because there are so many different religions in the Indian subcontinent, that a lot of their holidays, regardless of the religious tradition from which it comes, often kind of wend their way into all of the different religious traditions. And so, you're going to have similar celebrations for Hindus. You're going to have similar celebrations for um, Sikhs, for Buddhists, depending on what it is that's happening, they might celebrate it very differently in different regions that have more majorities of a particular religion than others. But again, it's hard to nail down um, these holidays because there are different connections to it in different religions. But for Holi, the from the Hindu perspective, this is the festival of colors, love, and spring. And there are two stories, two mythologies that are important for this holiday. The first one is a celebration of the love between a god and a goddess, Radha and Krishna. And the story is that Krishna was in love with um, Radha, who had fair skin. And Krishna felt like there was no way that Radha would ever love him because he had dark skin. And his mother got very tired of him complaining about how he was never going to be loved by this girl. And so she says, "Why don't you um, just go to her and tell her that she can make your face any color she wants?" And so he does that. And in doing so, I guess this charms her because they become a couple. And so, ever since, the story goes that the people commemorate this playful coloring of each other's faces as the celebration of Holi. So you can see here in the pictures there are people who are just covered head to toe in different colors. They use powders. They use water balloons or water little kind of water guns that have colored water in them. But the goal is to just absolutely destroy everybody's clothes by covering them in a variety of bright colors and having a good time. But there's a second story that goes along with this, and this is a story about not just love, but also the triumph of good over evil. And this is the victory of Vishnu um, over. And I'm going to try to say this without mangling it too much. Hiranyakashipu. Um, so this Hiranyakashipu was a king, and he was a demonic king, and he had earned five special powers. There were five things about him that made him special. He could not be killed by a human or an animal. He could not be killed indoors or outdoors. He could not be killed during the day or at night. He could not be killed by a projectile weapon nor by a handheld weapon. and he could not be killed on land or water or air. And so, because of all of these limitations to his ability to be killed, he became very arrogant. He thought that he was God and he demanded that everyone worship him. His own son, Prahlada, refused to worship him. He decided to remain devoted to the god Vishnu. And so his father, of course, became enraged. He tortured his son. He tried to force him to bow down, but he would not do it. None of this helped. So finally, um, Prahlada's aunt, who I guess is the sister of this evil king, tricked him into sitting on a pyre with her. She was wearing a special cloak that made her immune to fire, but Prahlada was not wearing anything like this. And so she set the pyre on fire. And as the fire spread, she was cackling with glee, I imagine. And the cloak jumped from her, wrapped around Prahlada, and he survived while his evil aunt burned. And Vishnu was able to accomplish this, and he then appeared to restore the belief in Hindu beliefs and belief in him. He took a special form, which was half human and half lion, which is neither human nor animal. He went at dusk, which is neither day nor night. He went into a doorstep with the king, so this is neither indoors nor outdoors because it's in the doorway. He put um, he put the king on his lap, which was neither land, water, nor air, and then he killed him with his lion claws, which were neither a handheld weapon nor a projectile weapon. And so he was able to kill the evil king. And so this story, not only making holy about not just love, but also about the victory of good over evil, also brings with it the tradition of the bonfire. The night before the festival with the colors begins, there is the tradition of having a bonfire, and it is the Holika bonfire, named after the evil aunt who burned up in it, and it signifies this celebration of good over evil and helps people to remember that act of Vishnu that was done to save the people and save their faith. Um, so the generally speaking, these are kind of the two background stories that go with this particular holiday. There are, as I said, lots of different variations in this. There is an element of spring to this celebration in different places, especially India and Nepal, celebrating the end of winter, the blossoming of love, um, kind of attempting to ask the gods for a good spring season. And it is believed that the this holiday finds its roots, not this holiday in particular necessarily, but it finds its roots in a holiday that developed sometime around the 4th century in India during an empire called the Gupta Empire. So it's very old. Um, let's see, what else do I have here? The color thing looks super fun. I don't know how I feel about inhaling all of that though.
Well, it's like a color run.
Yeah,
They have those now. Reminded me of that, but that certainly is not a religious festival.
yes. Parades and the color stuff in a variety of ways. Um, Bringing together of friend and foe, reconciliation can be part of it. Forgiveness, new starts, things like that. Kind of create a new unity in the community, even by letting go of old grudges and things like that. Were some of the other things that I had written down. Any other ideas, thoughts, questions on Holi? I lived in a a neighborhood of townhouses when Penny and Teddy were babies, and we had a lot of people who were immigrants from India, and so Holi was an exciting time. I would take the kids for walks. It was just it was a dead end at the end of a long road, and the whole neighborhood was just one big circle, and then there were little offshoots that had the houses on them, and so we would go and walk the neighborhood when the kids were little in their stroller or sometimes walking if they felt like it. And during Holi, it was fun because they would get out chalk and all the sidewalks would be covered in colorful images and all kinds of all kinds of fun stuff like that. So it was a good time. All right, moving on to some Christian festivals. I was going to do, just FYI, I was going to do the Spring Festival in China and other East Asian countries, but um, that's also, the New Year festival is the same. And so I felt like that was a little repetitive. So if you want to review that, you can go back to the New Year one and look at that again and think about how that might also connect to, newness and beginnings and things like that. Not all of these holidays fit neatly into one of my categories for sure. So Easter, we know Easter. The most interesting thing to me about Easter is that Easter is a movable feast, and so it's kind of challenging to remember exactly how it is computed. It's not like Christmas, which is on a particular calendar date in the year. Easter has had its fair share of controversies, even related to this. So originally, every Sunday, the Christians would get together and they would worship together. They would sing together. They would have a meal together, and that was in a significant way considered to be a weekly celebration of Easter, kind of a little Easter every single week to remember that Christ is risen, to celebrate what that means, and to remind ourselves of how we ought to live in light of that truth. Um, but then the desire to celebrate annually developed, and so the um, the the decision about when exactly we were going to celebrate this kind of became a problem. Some people were saying that they wanted to base Easter on the Hebrew calendar because in the Gospels, in particular, three of them, it is very, very connected to the Passover. And so making that connection is very important. And so they want to make sure that they are setting it up so that that connection remains. Um, the problem being that there is nothing related to the days of the week for the Passover, except for there is a little bit of adjustment when it happens in relationship to the Sabbath. And so if you are going to have Easter happen in relationship to Passover, then it might not be on Sunday. And it probably won't be because there's 7 days and only one of them is Sunday. So this was called the Quartodeciman controversy. And the people who wanted to follow the Hebrew calendar called themselves Quartodecimans because they wanted to have Lent end on the 14th quartodeciman of Nisan, which is the day before Passover begins. And they would call this the Lord's Passover because this is the Passover that Jesus celebrated um, with his followers before he died. But as I said, this is not Sunday, and so um, the Roman and Alexandrian churches wanted to keep Easter on Sunday, and they wanted to make sure that that connection remained, and so they didn't like that. Um, Surprisingly, for a while, this actually did not cause quite the disruption as that you would have thought, given some of the other things that we know about schisms in the church. Nobody, excommunicated anybody over this for quite a while. But eventually, it got bad enough that they decided that they were going to start excommunicating or attempting to excommunicate people, and it turned into a whole mess. And eventually, actually they were able to reconcile and not again not turn this into a, a major thing. Um, so the Western way of determining when Easter falls had then over the course of time kind of just it became assumed that it was going to be on Sunday. So this is by the year 725. Bede, the Venerable Bede, wrote about how you calculate this. He said, Easter falls on the Sunday following the full moon, which falls on or after the equinox. So that's not terrible, but it actually doesn't precisely reflect the rules. And so if we were to just use this basic rule to figure out when Easter is, generally speaking, you'd probably be okay. But it's actually a lot more complicated than that because the lunar year consists of some 30-day months and some 29-day months. And there is a period for Christians that make sure that the lunar cycle lines up with the solar cycle. And so there's always some couple of extra days, shoved in there to make sure that everything falls together properly. And so the um, the way that Easter is calculated is the third Sunday in the Paschal lunar month because the lunar month begins on the 1st and they want it to be near the 14th of the lunar month. But of course, we use solar calendar, and so it just turns into a whole big mess. So my opinion of all of this, even though it's funny and interesting in terms of like, haha, aren't we silly and doing all these weird things? But what I take away from this is if I want to know when Easter's going to be in a particular year, I just ask the internet because I have no idea. Um, so for Western Christians, we use the Gregorian calendar. Easter always falls between March 22nd and April 25th. And it is usually within about 7 days of the full moon. So it's not 14 days after the full moon. Which makes it, difficult to legitimize all of that other arguing. But yes, it doesn't matter because those people are so small now that they don't even, they don't even get a say. However, we do have the problem of Catholic Easter and Orthodox Easter. Catholic Easter being calculated sort of in the way that I just described, but Orthodox Easter being based on the Julian calendar rather than the Gregorian calendar. And so the Julian calendar is 5 days behind the full moon, and it kind of messes things up. And so most of the time, Orthodox Easter is going to be either on the same day as Catholic Easter, a week after Catholic Easter, 4 weeks after Catholic Easter, or 5 weeks after Catholic Easter. It can't be anything else. Those, because of the way that the two calculate themselves, those are the days. So they either share 1 week later, 4 weeks later, or 5 weeks later. And that is the case until at least the 2500s CE will be the case. There are lots of course, different understandings of how we celebrate Easter across the world. There's the Christian celebration, there's the not so Christian celebration, although some of it we have read back, and I don't know, how much of this is us attempting to connect our secular celebrations to the Christian and how much of it is actually fact. We've got Easter vigils that I think are really awesome, and the Orthodox make a big deal out of the Easter vigil and begin services late Saturday evening to um, light a candle in the dark to represent the resurrection of Christ, and then the slow growing of light as the day approaches, which I think is a really cool image. Um, Hot cross buns are something that I was surprised to see all really across the world. I guess it makes sense because it's got the cross in it, and so I guess different places, make them with different ingredients, but um, the way of making the bun so that it's got that cross shape in it is very popular in Europe and Africa and the Americas and Asia. Um, the Easter egg, I did some looking about the Easter egg because I'm just not entirely sure about this. I know that Mary Magdalene, she has a red egg that is that often appears in her icons, and so there is something with colored egg. Um, One sociology professor that I was reading some information about said that the use of the Easter egg seems to have come from Persia into the Greek churches and to Russia and Siberia through Orthodox Christianity, and that they started mostly with red eggs, but also used green and yellow. There is an understanding of the tradition of the egg roll that today we see happening most popularly, widely known at the White House, is popular all around the world, although the rules and what it is you're doing can vary. Hunting for eggs is, again, maybe connected historically, or maybe just a reading back to try to connect this strange custom to Christianity, connecting the search for the eggs with Mary's search for the empty tomb, thinking that they weren't there when Jesus was actually buried, and so they didn't know where to look for him. And then when they found him, it was empty. So I'm not entirely sure how I feel about the bunnies and the eggs and all that. Have either of you ever heard anything that felt a little more convincing about that connection?
Never understood that.
No.
But, I mean, it's fun. So,
Yes, it is fun. It's just a little bit like Santa Claus kneeling at the manger. Like doesn't really connect easily in my mind.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
All right, well, I have one more for us that comes from the Christian tradition. This is called, in some places, Rogation Tide or Rogation or Rogate, the Rogate period, Rogate Sunday, Rogation Sunday. Rogation is a word that comes from Latin, and it means to ask. And so, in a variety of more liturgical churches, like the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church and the Lutheran Church, there is a recognition of rogation, asking for God's protection from calamities, and particularly connecting it to um, to the springtime and to the planting and harvest, sorry, not harvest, the planting season. So, generally speaking, the first rogation, the most important rogation, is held on April 25th of every year. So that'll be on Saturday for some of these groups, or the nearest Sunday if it's a Sunday thing. And then there are understood to be minor rogations that happen preceding Ascension Day. So this idea of connecting connecting the springtime, but also connecting Jesus' time on earth and then Jesus' preparation for ascension to this beseeching, rogation, not being a word connected to agricultural, even though it sounds like it's a word connected to agriculture, but being a word connected to that asking, beseeching of God. Um, Rogation is understood to be a pretty clear replacement of a Roman celebration. It was a procession um, known as Robigalia, and it, unfortunately, in my opinion, involved sacrificing a dog to the deity of agricultural disease, Robigus. And so people who participated were asking Robigus for protection of their crops from pestilence and things like that. So luckily, we don't do any sacrificing of dogs anymore. Otherwise, I would not be participating in this, nor would I be even talking about it because I'd be so angry.
Exactly.
Um, but there are some traditions related to rogation. So you can see up there in the upper left and then down in the center with the black and white photo, the priests and pastors there are participating in a ceremony called the beating of the bounds. And what would happen is the parishioners would follow the minister around the boundary of their parish. So this comes from a time when, you know, the space that is cared for by the priest is not based on who is a member of their church, but based on the land that is occupied by that church. And so they would go around the edges of that whole area and they would pray for the protection of their parish over the course of the next year. Um, Nowadays, because we don't have that strong connection, maybe a little bit still in the Catholic Church, but certainly not the Anglican and Lutheran traditions. It's um, more of a smaller connection. So perhaps they walk the edges of the church property, or they go to the farm of somebody that can be, representative of their congregation. Or if you see there in the upper right, you might recognize that little family there participating in a Rogation Sunday celebration at Mansville Lutheran Church in Mansville, Pennsylvania, where the pastor invited the farmers to bring their tractors and cows and sheep and whatever else they wanted to bring that represented their farms to the church that day. And he went around and he blessed all of those things so that they could take them back and represent the blessing of God on their efforts to make make the earth fruitful for the following year. And two little tiny people really had a good time at that particular worship service. They got to sit on all the tractors and get their pictures taken, and it was a lot of fun. So I think that's a fun one. I miss doing that. So any questions or comments on that one?
I'll just throw out that we have in the past had summer worship at, excuse me, in Caldwell Park and a blessing of the animals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of times if it's just the animals, they do that in October because that is when the Festival of St. Francis is, and St. Francis is the patron saint of animals. So that's popular, but of course, summertime is, it just lends itself more to to being outside, and a lot of times we don't necessarily want to bring all of our cows into the worship space indoors, and they don't want to be indoors, and so we fudge it a little bit. But yeah, those are fun. Anything else? All right. So kind of wrapping it up, I think we've got, certainly the new life and rebirth kind of elements, both in terms of actual, the rebirth of the world, rebirth of the earth, rebirth of agriculture, also the rebirth of relationships, the rebirth of uh, opportunities, things like that. Um, Interestingly, I think there's a lot in there, related to um, salvation, forgiveness, new starts. The the Even in holy, that doesn't, does not Hinduism does not have a role to play in the development of Christianity. This time of year seems to tend to lend itself to, reconciliation among people who are just not getting along, and reconnecting with the community, and things like that. So there's definitely something to be said for for this time of year being connected in those ways, regardless of your um, religious persuasion, or none at all. Any other ideas that I missed? Did you see any other patterns in any of those?
It's just like all the other ones that you've talked about. I mean, there's these common themes, you know.
Yeah, yeah, and it's I think it's really cool. It kind of reminds us that we, even though we talk about it differently, and we have different ways of acknowledging it, the human experience is much more common to all than I think we like to acknowledge. So I've really
Yeah,
appreciated that.
and the whole idea of community and family and you know, all of it. I mean, it's just really cool.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Well, if that is all everybody has, then we can wrap it up for today. I thank you for being here and for your wise comments. And we will meet one more time next month to talk about the summer. And then that'll be it for this year.
I appreciate all your hard work.
Oh, it's fun. I enjoy it.
Me too. I enjoy listening to you present. And it, well, and from all this information that you must get initially, what you glean from it and then present to us is interesting.
It's definitely a challenge that I enjoy, trying to pare it all down and find those connections, but also not, create them. Like, if I don't want to reject so much information that I'm just making up things, right? But to try to find that balance of not talking at you for 3 hours, but also covering enough, and also finding those connections without rejecting things that don't fit in. I enjoy
Well, you do a good job.
it. Thank you. All right. Well, you two have a lovely evening, and I will see you soon.
Okay.
Take care.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.